The road to Salt Lake? The old Ford F-4 rumbled up the gravel driveway, its engine humming like a tired but faithful companion. Dust rose behind it, glowing in the late Colorado sun. Henry leaned forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield as his little white house came into view. The porch light still worked, flickering once, then holding steady, as if welcoming them back home. Margaret sighed softly beside him. "Home sweet home," she murmured, smiling as Buddy, their golden retriever, perked up in the back seat, his tail thumping against the window. The long road from Niagara had left them both quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after good memories, and the realization that something special has ended. When they stepped out, the air smelled of pine and dry grass. Henry stretched his back with a low grunt, while Margaret walked to the porch and ran her hand over the railing. She had painted it last spring. "Needs another coat," she said automatically, her eyes twinkling. "Add it to the list," Henry chuckled, patting the hood of the truck, "along with a new muffler for this old fella." That evening, after the bags were unpacked and Buddy was fed, they settled on the porch with steaming mugs of coffee. The sun slipped behind the foothills, leaving streaks of gold and violet across the sky. The cicadas started their song, and the air grew cooler, brushing their cheeks like an old friend. "You ever think about what's next?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but curious. Henry chuckled. "I thought this was next, sitting here, enjoying peace and quiet." She looked at him with that half smile that had followed him through 40 years of marriage. "You don't sit still very well, Henry Johnson. You start tapping your foot the minute life slows down." He sipped his coffee and said nothing for a while. The porch light buzzed faintly, and Buddy lay at their feet, his ears twitching at the sound of a distant owl. Somewhere down the hill, a car engine echoed in the valley. Someone else's story beginning. "You know," Henry said finally, "I read something about Salt Lake City the other day. Some magazine at that diner near Topeka. They had a picture of the Great Salt Lake, said the sunsets there turn the whole sky pink." Margaret tilted her head. "Salt Lake City, Utah? Yeah," he said. "Right there by the lake. They say the air smells different, kind of sharp, kind of sweet, and the mountains rise up right behind the water like they're watching over it." Margaret smiled. "Sounds beautiful." Henry shrugged, but his eyes were far away. "Wouldn't mind seeing it. Maybe drive through the canyons, spend a night or two by the water, just to see what all the fuss is about." She looked at him for a long moment. "You mean another trip? Already?" He laughed. "Don't act surprised. You're the one who keeps the maps." She laughed too, leaning back in her chair. "You know, Buddy would love that. More sticks to chase, more new smells." As if on cue, the dog lifted his head and wagged his tail. They sat in comfortable silence again. The porch creaked softly, and somewhere inside, the old clock in the hallway chimed 8. Margaret watched the sky fade to indigo and felt a spark of something. Not restlessness exactly, but that tug of curiosity that had been growing ever since their first road trip. "Salt Lake City," she repeated quietly, tasting the words. "Maybe we could go before winter sets in. The weather's still good, and the Ford's just about ready." Henry raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're not the one who can't sit still?" She grinned. "Maybe you're rubbing off on me." The next morning, Henry was up early as usual. The world outside was covered in a thin veil of mist. He stood by the window, watching as the first rays of sun hit the mountains. The Ford sat in the driveway, its blue paint dulled by dust, but the sight of it filled him with something like pride. That old truck had carried them through half the country already. By the time Margaret came down, he was already in the garage, sleeves rolled up, tinkering under the hood. "You're not wasting any time," she said, handing him a mug of coffee. He took it, grinning. "Figure if we're going to hit the road again, I better make sure this old beast doesn't cough out its last breath in Utah." Buddy padded into the garage, tail wagging, sniffing at the tires. Margaret leaned against the doorway, watching the two of them. "You know," she said, "most people our age are downsizing, staying close to home. You ever wonder if we're supposed to be doing the same?" Henry didn't look up. "Most people don't have a dog like Buddy, or a wife who still smiles every time we see a new place." She smiled softly. "That's a good answer." By noon, the air was warm, and the yard was alive with the smell of cut grass. Margaret was out back tending to her flowers, humming to herself, while Henry changed the oil and wiped the dust off the Ford's fenders. He looked at the horizon, the faint line of mountains to the west, and thought about the endless roads waiting just beyond them. That evening, when they sat down for dinner, the decision had already been made without a single official word. Margaret brought out a notepad and pen. "So," she said, "how long do you think it'll take to get there?" Henry smiled. "About a day and a half if we take the scenic route. 2 if we stop for pie." She laughed. "Then 2 it is." Buddy barked, as if agreeing. And just like that, the adventure had begun again. Not with a big plan or a dramatic moment, but with the quiet certainty that the road was calling once more. As the stars came out over the Colorado hills, Margaret rested her head on Henry's shoulder and whispered, "Promise me one thing." "What's that?" "That we'll never stop dreaming of the next place." Henry squeezed her hand. "Deal." Out in the driveway, the old Ford sat waiting, gleaming faintly in the starlight, a silent companion ready to roll once more toward the horizon. The morning they left Colorado, the world was still half asleep. A pale blue dawn stretched across the sky, painting the horizon behind their little house in a soft, familiar glow. Henry loaded the last of the bags into the Ford F-150, while Margaret stood by the porch steps, sipping coffee from her favorite mug, the one with a faded Route 66 logo. Buddy, as always, was first in the truck bed, tail wagging like a metronome of anticipation. "You ready?" Henry called. Margaret smiled, locking the front door and giving the old porch railing one last pat. "I was born ready," she said, sliding into the passenger seat. The engine rumbled to life with a familiar growl. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and just like that, their house became smaller in the rearview mirror. Another chapter behind them. Ahead lay the open road, a ribbon of promise stretching through the plains. By mid-morning they had left the foothills behind. The highway ran wide and empty, flanked by fields of wheat that rippled like a golden ocean in the breeze. A few old barns leaned into the horizon, their faded red paint peeling under decades of sun. Henry had one hand on the wheel, the other tapping in rhythm with an old Eagles song playing from the cassette deck. "Remember when this song came out?" Margaret asked, looking out the window. "Sure do," Henry said. "You made me drive all the way to Denver to buy that record. Said you couldn't live without it." She laughed. Still true. They passed through a small town called Green River, one of those places with a single stoplight and a diner that doubled as the post office. The sign outside read, "Mary's Diner, home of the mile-high pie." Henry slowed down. "What do you think? Pie break?" Margaret smiled. "You even have to ask?" Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and cinnamon. A row of old men sat at the counter, talking about fishing and the weather. The waitress, a woman with a beehive hairstyle and a name tag that said Loretta, greeted them with a grin. "Y'all passing through?" she asked. "On our way to Salt Lake," Henry replied, taking a seat in a booth by the window. "Well, you picked the right stop," Loretta said, handing the menus. "Best pie west of Kansas City. My mama's recipe. Been winning over travelers since '62. Buddy waited patiently in the truck outside, occasionally poking his head up to watch through the window. Margaret glanced back at him fondly. "He's probably hoping for crust." "Don't worry, honey," Loretta said with a wink. "I always send the 4-legged ones a treat." They ate slowly, savoring every bite of cherry pie and every sip of strong coffee. Outside, the wind stirred dust along the main street, carrying the faint sound of a freight train somewhere in the distance. Henry leaned back, looking out the window at the open road. "Places like this," he said, "they remind me of something, how the world keeps moving, even when it looks like nothing's changed." Margaret nodded. "Maybe that's what makes it beautiful." When they left, Loretta wrapped 2 extra slices of pie in foil for the road and waved as they drove off. Henry honked twice, Buddy barked once, and the Ford rolled back onto the highway, the sky opening wide above them. The landscape shifted slowly as the day went on. Flat fields gave way to rolling hills, and the color of the earth deepened from gold to burnt orange. They crossed into Utah by late afternoon, the welcome sign standing lonely against a backdrop of distant mesas. Margaret reached over and turned down the radio. "It's funny," she said. How you can drive for hours and still feel like you're nowhere near done discovering this country. Henry nodded. That's America for you. Always another stretch of road. They stopped at a scenic overlook just before sunset. From there, the land fell away into a vast canyon glowing with copper light. Margaret stepped out and breathed deeply, letting the wind play with her hair. Henry leaned against the truck, watching her, the corners of his mouth curving into a quiet smile. You know, he said, if I could bottle this moment, I would. She looked back at him, eyes bright. Maybe that's what stories are for. Buddy trotted between them, wagging his tail, sniffing every patch of sagebrush as if it were the most important mission in the world. The smell of dry earth and wild thyme filled the air, and the first stars began to appear above the vast open sky. That night, they pulled into a roadside inn near Price, Utah. It was one of those classic motor lodges from the 1960s. Faded neon sign, peeling turquoise paint, and a tiny cafe attached. The clerk, a young man with tattoos and sleepy eyes, gave them the key to room 7. Got a spot out back where your dog can stretch his legs, he said. And the cafe opens at 6 if you're heading out early. Henry nodded, pocketing the key. Appreciate it. Inside, the room smelled faintly of pine cleaner and desert dust. Margaret opened the window, and the cool night air drifted in, carrying the sound of crickets and the hum of the highway. Henry sat on the edge of the bed, unlacing his boots, while Buddy curled up on the rug near the door. It's not the Marriott, Margaret said with a laugh. No, Henry replied, but it's got character. They lay in bed later, side by side, the ceiling fan spinning lazily above them. Through the window, the neon sign flickered, casting a soft red glow on the curtains. The hum of a passing semi rumbled through the quiet. You ever think, Margaret whispered, how lucky we are to be able to just go? Henry turned toward her, his hand finding hers. Every damn day. By sunrise, the Ford was back on the road. The sky blushed pink over the horizon, and the scent of coffee from the cafe lingered in the cab. They passed through Provo, where church bells rang faintly from a white-steepled chapel, and then the highway began to climb. Mountains rose on both sides now, their snow-dusted peaks glinting in the morning light. Margaret watched the landscape change, her reflection ghosting across the window glass. You know, she said softly, no matter how far we drive, it always feels like we're going home. Henry smiled. Maybe home's just wherever we're together. Buddy barked once in agreement, as if to say amen to that. The road curved ahead, and somewhere beyond the next ridge, Salt Lake City waited, a shimmer of promise beneath the wide western sky. By the time they reached Salt Lake City, the afternoon sun hung low behind the Wasatch Mountains, bathing the skyline in gold. Henry steered the Ford F-150 down a wide avenue lined with trees that shimmered like copper in the light. The city was clean, quiet, and somehow both modern and timeless, like it had grown slowly but purposefully, one red brick at a time. Margaret leaned forward in her seat, eyes wide. Would you look at that? She said, pointing toward the temple spires that reached into the sky like polished ivory. Looks like something out of a postcard. Henry nodded, slowing at a stoplight. Can't say I've ever seen a church like that. Bet they keep it spotless. Buddy barked from the back seat, tail thumping against the seat. He seemed to sense they'd arrived somewhere special. They checked into a small boutique hotel downtown, the Wasatch Inn, with its old-fashioned brass keys and a lobby that smelled faintly of cedar and lemon polish. A young woman at the desk smiled as she handed them their key. Welcome to Salt Lake. You two in town for the views or the food? Both, Henry said. We've been on the road a while. Figured we'd treat ourselves to a little civilization. The clerk grinned. You came to the right place. The lake's magic at sunset. Looks like it goes on forever. Folks say it mirrors the soul. Margaret smiled. After the miles we've driven, we could use a little soul polishing. They spent the afternoon walking through Temple Square, where the gardens bloomed even in late summer. Neat rows of tulips and hydrangeas surrounding the grand white temple. Bells chimed gently from somewhere unseen. People moved quietly. Families, tourists, young couples, all caught up in the strange serenity of the place. Henry adjusted his cap and whispered, Don't see many places like this back home. No, Margaret said softly. You can almost feel the calm in the air. A kind-faced older woman approached them near the reflecting pool. "Would you like me to take your picture?" she asked. Henry hesitated. "Depends. Can you make us look 20 years younger?" She laughed. "Sweetheart, I can make you look happy. That's all that matters." And she did. The photo she took, the two of them smiling with the temple behind them and the reflection shimmering in the water, would later become one of their favorites. By late afternoon, they made their way toward the Great Salt Lake. The highway west stretched straight as a ruler, with the sun turning the air into liquid gold. As they neared the water, the scent of salt and wind filled the cab, sharp and ancient, like the memory of the sea. Henry parked near a weathered wooden dock that jutted out into the shallows. "Looks like the end of the earth," he said quietly. Margaret stepped out, her shoes crunching on the pale, salty sand, or the beginning of something. Buddy bounded ahead, nose down, tail high, chasing the gulls that circled lazily above the water. His paws left prints that glittered faintly where the light caught the thin crust of salt. They walked to the water's edge. The surface of the lake was like glass, reflecting the mountains and the wide open sky in perfect stillness. Even the air seemed to pause. Henry took a deep breath. "You smell that? Reminds me of the coast." Margaret laughed. "Except there's no ocean and no surfers. Guess we'll have to make do." They sat on a driftwood log near the shore. The sky turned orange, then rose, then violet. The horizon blurred where water met air until it was impossible to tell which was which. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Margaret said softly, "Do you think we'll ever stop chasing horizons?" Henry looked at her, his face warmed by the fading light. "Why would we? The day we stop living." She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "You and your cowboy wisdom." He chuckled. "Hey, I earned every gray hair on this head. Might as well use them." A few locals were scattered along the shoreline, some photographers with tripods, a couple of teenagers skipping stones, an old man in a folding chair staring at the horizon like he was waiting for something only he could see. A small group of pelicans drifted by, their white feathers catching the last of the light. Buddy returned to them, panting and happy, his fur sparkling with flecks of salt. Margaret brushed him off and said, "You're going to smell like the ocean all the way back to Colorado." Henry laughed. "Better than how he smelled after the river back in Missouri." They watched as the first stars began to pierce the twilight, their reflections shimmering faintly in the water. The lake, now almost black, still mirrored every detail of the sky. When the air grew cooler, they headed back to the truck. The Ford gleamed softly in the moonlight, dust from the day's drive catching in its chrome edges. Henry opened the door for Margaret, something he'd always done, and she smiled at the small, familiar gesture. "Still the gentleman," she said. "Still the lady worth it," he replied. The drive back into town was quiet. Streetlights flickered on as they passed through the city, their glow mingling with the last remnants of dusk. They stopped at a small diner near their hotel. A neon sign outside read Big Sky Cafe, open late. Inside, the air smelled of grilled onions and coffee. A jukebox in the corner played an old Patsy Cline song. The waitress, wearing a plaid shirt and a silver name tag that said Becca, came over with a smile. "What can I get y'all?" she asked. "Couple of burgers, fries, and 2 coffees," Henry said. "Oh, and maybe a bowl of water for our friend outside." "You got it," Becca said with a wink. When the food came, it was perfect, messy, juicy, and real. They ate like travelers do, grateful for something simple and warm. Through the window, the neon lights flickered pink and blue against the chrome of their Ford, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Back at the hotel, Henry stood by the window while Margaret got ready for bed. The city below was peaceful, small lights twinkling between the mountains like scattered fireflies. Buddy was already asleep, curled into a perfect golden circle by the door. Margaret climbed into bed and said softly, "You thinking about tomorrow?" Henry nodded. "Always am." She reached for his hand. "Then don't forget this part, this calm, this feeling." He squeezed her fingers gently. "Wouldn't dream of it." Outside, the wind whispered across the city, and somewhere far off, the lake shimmered under the stars, endless, quiet, and full of promise. The morning sun shimmered on the surface of the Great Salt Lake like a sea of liquid glass. The air was crisp, laced with salt and the faint sweetness of sagebrush. Henry stood by the small marina, tightening the straps of his windbreaker, while Buddy sniffed every coil of rope and post in sight. Margaret came up behind him, her scarf fluttering in the cool wind. "You sure about this?" she asked, eyeing the boat tied to the dock. A modest white and blue motorboat with a faded name painted on the side, Wind Dancer. Henry grinned. "You heard the guy at the bait shop. Calm waters today. Besides, what's a trip to Salt Lake without a little sailing?" She smiled, shaking her head. "Next thing I know, you'll be buying one." He laughed. "Now there's an idea." They climbed aboard, helped by an older man in a sun-faded cap who introduced himself as Carl, the boat's owner. "She's steady as she looks," he said, patting the hull. "You two enjoy yourselves. Just keep her in the shallows. Lake's got moods, same as people." Margaret chuckled. "Don't we know it?" The motor purred softly as they pulled away from the dock. Ripples spread out behind them, and the city began to fade into the hazy blue distance. The air tasted of salt and freedom. Gulls circled lazily overhead, their cries sharp and musical. Henry steered while Margaret sat beside him, one hand resting lightly on his arm. Buddy stood near the bow, his fur glinting in the sun, ears pricked forward as if he were the captain himself. "Would you look at that?" Margaret whispered. The reflection of the mountains lay across the water like a perfect mirror, so still that even the clouds seemed afraid to move. "Feels like we're floating between two worlds," Henry said quietly. She nodded. "The one we came from and the one we're still chasing." They cruised for nearly an hour, the hum of the engine blending with the soft rush of wind. Every so often, Henry would cut the throttle, and they'd drift in silence, surrounded by nothing but shimmering water and the faraway whisper of waves against the shore. At one point, Buddy barked sharply and wagged his tail, spotting a small flock of pelicans gliding past. Henry smiled. "Guess he's found his kind." "Don't tell him that," Margaret said. "He already thinks he runs the show." They shared a quiet laugh, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly balanced. The world vast, their hearts light, and time itself unhurried. Later they anchored near a small, rocky outcropping where the lake shallowed into silver-gray sand. Margaret pulled out a thermos of coffee and 2 pastries from the diner. They sat on the edge of the boat, legs swinging above the water, and sipped in silence. "You ever think," she said finally, "that maybe we're making up for lost time?" Henry smiled. "I think we're finally using it right." She tilted her head. "You always did have the last word." He grinned. "It's a husband's job." She gave his shoulder a gentle nudge, laughing, the sound carrying softly over the water. By early afternoon, the wind picked up, and they decided to head back. As they neared the marina, the horizon darkened with distant storm clouds. Henry glanced up. "Looks like the weather's turning." Margaret tightened her jacket. "Then it's a good thing we've got miles ahead and a solid truck waiting." They thanked Carl, who waved them off with a smile. "Safe travels," he called out. "And if you're headed north, keep an eye out. Yellowstone's something else this time of year." Henry turned to Margaret, eyebrows raised. "You hear that?" She smirked. "Oh, I heard it. And don't think for a second that it's not already in your head." That evening, they loaded up the Ford F-150. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the mountains. Margaret arranged the map across the dashboard, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. "Let's see," she murmured, tracing a line northward. "Salt Lake to Jackson Hole, then into Yellowstone." Henry adjusted his cap. "Long haul. You sure you're up for it?" She gave him a look. "After Niagara and the Rockies, you think a few more miles are going to scare me?" He chuckled. "Didn't think so." Buddy leapt into the back seat, curling up on his blanket as if he already knew the plan. They left the city behind just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The sky turned to slate, and lightning flickered along the distant peaks. The wipers brushed rhythmically, and the sound of rain against the roof became a kind of music. For miles they drove in comfortable silence, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. Every now and then, Margaret would glance at the map or hum along to a tune on the radio, an old Eagles song that somehow fit the moment perfectly. When the storm finally broke, they stopped at a small overlook. Below them stretched miles of open valley, washed clean and gleaming under a pale, new light. The storm clouds drifted away, leaving behind a rainbow faintly arched across the sky. Henry got out, took a deep breath and turned to Margaret. "Reminds me of why we do this," he said quietly. She joined him, slipping her arm through his. "Because it makes us feel alive." He nodded. "Because there's always another road." They stood there for a long time, watching the light shift over the wet hills. Buddy barked once, impatient, as if reminding them that the adventure wasn't over yet. Henry grinned. "All right, partner. Next stop, Yellowstone." The engine started with a familiar rumble. The Ford rolled forward, its tires splashing through shallow puddles, carrying them north, toward geysers, wilderness, and whatever waited beyond the next bend in the road.